Good afternoon, and welcome to our second panel of the inaugural Lehman College Bronx Environmental Summit, In the Bronx, From Environmental Injustice to Environmental Equity. My name is Duran Fayak, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Lehman College and one of the summit organizers. As we've learned from the rich presentations and discussions today, most recently Peggy Shepard's illuminating talk, as well as the effects of the pandemic on the residents of New York City, there are a variety of environmental and institutional conditions that contribute to the disproportionate exposure of Bronx residents to environmental and public health risks and impacts. On this panel, we are fortunate to have a number of speakers from a collection of diverse organizations that have worked extensively to address these vulnerabilities for residents within the Bronx and beyond. We plan to discuss several of the local environmental challenges experienced by residents, some of which may be exacerbated by climate change, their implications for climate policy and environmental equity, and the role and approach that our panelists' organizations take to address these issues. Just a quick note, as the session takes place, please feel free to use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, which to submit your questions for the panelists. And we will field questions from the audience during the last 15 minutes of the panel. It is now my pleasure to introduce you to our panel moderator, Kendra Pierre-Louis. Kendra is a climate reporter who currently works for Gimlet, the podcasting company. Prior to joining Gimlet, Kendra spent time reporting for the New York Times and was a staff writer for Popular Science, where she wrote about science, the environment, and occasionally mayonnaise. With that, I'm going to turn the panel over to Kendra.
Thank you, Duran. We've a really great panel for you today. And rather than take the time for me to deeply introduce them, I'm going to let them introduce themselves to you, beginning with Robert Fannuzzi, the president of the Bronx Council for Environmental Quality.
Thank you, and it's great to be among Lehman College friends again. I am a professor at St. John's University, so don't let anybody from St. John's hear this, but I miss Lehman and the Lehman community. I'm really happy to be among you again. I'm also a Bronx resident, and you'll hear a little bit about how I personally have become committed to environmental justice in the Bronx and why I think this is one of the most incredible places in the United States to really make an impact for environmental justice. So I want to give an overview of the Bronx Council for Environmental Quality. We advocate for nature-based solutions to problems created by urban development. We hope to mitigate the environmental impacts, and we also seek to promote environmental policies that let nature take care of our climate and our water and our air the way it's supposed to. So we have been an organization for 50 years. We date to a time that's very interesting to consider, when the Bronx was known for one thing. It was known for the urban crisis, which was a euphemism for all kinds of racial economic crises at the end of the 1960s and 70s. Okay, and at the same time, there was an environmental movement cresting throughout the United States. It took a look at nature often outside cities, and what the Bronx Council for Environmental Quality recognized was that the Bronx, number one, was a natural space and that it was having an environmental crisis, okay? And the audacity of thinking of the Bronx as having environmental issues, I think is so important, and I think has changed the way that environmental studies has progressed and turned into racial justice movements and public policy that really supports a whole complement of programs and initiatives that all people need, not just where there are no cities. So we were really committed to a couple of major projects and remain committed to a couple of major projects based around water quality. And I just want to emphasize that because it's the federal law for air and water quality that called this organization into being and gives us that name, Quality. First, that we really started a commitment to understanding the impact of upstate development on downstate water supplies, the watershed. protection of the watershed, what that would do to our city water. And the failure to protect that led directly to the Croton filtration plant that is right in Lehman's backyard, almost ended up in your front yard in Jerome Park Reservoir. Secondly, we saw back in the 70s and 80s that overdevelopment was causing water runoff into our waterways. We are surrounded by water. And we saw that if we are ever going to meet water quality standards, we need to change the way that we build stuff on land. So that has led to a whole kind of preservation efforts that to protect our land, protect our waterway, create green infrastructure policies, because we need to protect everything that goes into our water and air. And lastly, the part of it is waterfront access. My friends and colleagues here will tell us about this. We're surrounded by water on all sides except the north, and we really have lagged behind other boroughs in policies that allow access and protect our water. So we'll definitely go into much more detail about the policies and problems that we're facing now and the challenges and opportunities. But we really are an organization that seeks to build better on land so our water and air and our people are healthier.
Thank you, Robert. Next up, we're going to hear from Maggie Greenfield, who's the Executive Director of the Bronx River Alliance.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Maggie Greenfield. I am the Executive Director of the Bronx River Alliance, as Kendra just said. I'm also the Bronx River Administrator for New York City Parks Department. And that dual title really embodies, illustrates the partnership, the public-private partnership that's behind the effort on the Bronx River. But I want to just start by saying thank you to Chief Perry of the Ramapo Lenape people who kicked us off this morning with the land acknowledgement and who reminded us that we are all here as guardians for the land and for the water and for the air, and that we have really a lot to learn from the old ways. And so also before the Bronx River was called the Bronx River and before the Bronx was actually called the Bronx, the river that flowed right down through the middle of this landmass was known as Aquehong, which is the river of high bluffs in the native language of the Lenape people. And the Lenape people really did care for the river, and they cared for the river for centuries, so much so that this river here in the Bronx ran silver every spring with the migration of the river herring that would come back every year, just like we have salmon out west. And we think of the big fish migrations. We used to have those here on the East Coast, all up and down our eastern seaboard. And we've largely forgotten that because we've become so disconnected from our rivers and from the natural environment itself. And we, as the European colonizers to this land, were not good guardians of the land and the water and the air. And so the river, the Bronx River, which mirrors the history of many urban rivers throughout this country, fell into really a cycle of degradation and restoration, and then degradation again. And the most recent efforts to bring this river back and to restore it really centered in the South Bronx in the late 1990s around the nascent environmental justice movement that was forming and asking questions about why are the dirtiest rivers in low-income communities and why is the air the hardest to breathe in these communities. And leaders from groups like Youth Ministries for Peace and Justice and The Point, DDC, and many, many others came together and started asking, why does the Bronx River look like this? When you can even find it, which half the time you can't in the South Bronx, why is it full of garbage down here? Why is it so dirty? How come that beautiful river that flows through Westchester County that's so easy to get to and so green, why does it look so different down here? And it was really out of those, that community organizing and that effort that birthed the Bronx River Alliance. And we were formed in 2001. So this is now our 20-year anniversary. And we're very pleased to be continuing this work that is decades long, decades in the making and decades to come to protect, improve, and restore the Bronx River so it can be a healthy resource for the communities to which it flows.
Thank you, Maggie. Next up, we're going to hear from Elgoria Harrison, who is the Dean of the School of Health Sciences, Human Services, and Nursing here at Lehman.
Thank you so much, Kendra, and it's been a pleasure to have been a part of this panel and also to have learned a lot from many of the speakers earlier today. I actually said earlier that I actually canceled all of my other meetings so that I can actually participate. So as Kendra said, I am Elgoria Harrison. I am the Dean of the School of Health Science, Human Services, and Nursing. I come to Lehman College as of August of 2020. So I'm very new to the Bronx area, and I actually do live in the Bronx. So I come to Lehman from Washington, D.C., where I will speak to some of the things that we accomplish in the Bronx. I'm a community-based researcher, so I'm really interested and have always been interested in helping communities really articulate what they're feeling about their communities. And certainly I worked with a low-income neighborhood in Washington, D.C. Called the Buzzard Point neighborhood. And it just so happens that the Buzzard Point neighborhood is really very close to the Anacostia and the Potomac rivers. And there is a lot of discussion that we could have about those particular rivers, and that's close to the this particular neighborhood. I actually, for my training, I am a respiratory therapist by profession. And certainly when I got involved in this whole environmental justice, it really came as a result of my health background and the fact of the matter that many of our children, adults in that particular neighborhood were really suffering from asthma, or what we call asthma exacerbation. And so I come at it from that. I personally wanted to understand whether or not there were connections between the environment and asthma and the rates that we were seeing in the Washington, D.C. area. And as I began to think about, coming to, the New York area, I said earlier, I really didn't know much about the Bronx. My daughter lived in Brooklyn, and so I knew, I thought maybe that was all of New York, but then I learned there was a bigger piece of New York than I had really imagined. And so in my learning about the Bronx, I began to realize that many of the issues that I dealt with in Washington, D.C., in these particular neighborhoods were very similar to the issues that I am finding, as I research about what's happening in the Bronx in terms of the health outcomes. So I also represent the CUNY Institute for Health Equity. And one of the things that we hope to be able to contribute to, to this whole notion of health equity and health disparity is to be able to help communities co-produce research that really is going to help change some of the outcomes in the Bronx and perhaps the state of New York. And so I'm very excited about, what I believe is my role as the dean. We have a number of researchers, a number of scientists in my area, and I think that we would be able to bring a lot to the table, and I'm very much looking forward to being able to orchestrate a lot of those things. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Our last speaker is Mikkel Johnson, the co-founder of South Bronx Unite.
Thank you, Kendra. Hi, I'm Michael Johnson. And
sorry,
this spelled differently, but sounds the same. I'm so happy to be here. Again, I'm a co-founding member of South Bronx Unite. I'm so happy that Lehman College put forth this panel and this whole day of Bronx Environmental Summit, which is so important. The title of this panel is so really sensitive to me in the work we do in Mott Haven, Port Morris community of the South Bronx. Environmental inequity or environmental injustice to environmental equity is so important to my community, which is a community predominantly of color, living in one of the most environmentally oppressed or economically oppressed and environmentally oppressed communities in the entire United States. Our coalition came together as neighbors, parents, friends, other organizations to stop the cycle that has plagued our community for decades. Starting off with Robert Moses, cutting a path through the Bronx, creating the Cross Bronx Expressway. After that, the highway systems continued encircling our neighborhoods, choking our youth, choking our community, to the point where we have like asthma hospitalization rates 8 times the national average, 21 times any other New York City community. That the same thing travels on highways, not only contributes to asthma and air quality, but also cardiovascular diseases that affect us, made us more susceptible to COVID because of our pre-existing conditions that has been a result of the built environment that's taken place here in the Bronx over and over again. Top-down decision-making, like what Robert Moses did, continued even to today. We have very little community participation in development that's taking place to our community, but not for our community. And so our advocacy is around air quality, access to green space, looking at fighting for the right to breathe has led us to the fight to the right to stay as well. Our communities face now with real estate speculation and displacement potentially. And so our environmental advocacy has grown to also environmental or social justice issues and economic justice. But when we talk about environmental injustice in the South Bronx, it's environmental racism. Because the reason why these things have plagued our communities for decades is because we're a poor community of color. The things you see happening in the South Bronx will not occur anywhere else, to the extent it's happening here. Our peninsula is totally encircled by 3 sides by water, but we have no access to it. Some 90,000 people who live here who shoulder the burden for all of the Bronx waste, 4 peaker plants on our waterfront, heavy diesel truck intensive businesses creating this largest significant maritime industrial area of the city, at least one of those largest. But for shouldering all that burden, we don't have the equity, we don't have the equitable access to green space that creates quality of life. So our advocacy is around creating balance, creating quality of life for our residents who have long shouldered the burden for a lot of things the rest of New York City didn't want. In the way of, again, waste transfer stations, in the way of heavy diesel truck intensive businesses. You don't find these in Riverdale, right? You don't find these in more white, economically affluent communities. And when you see the correlation between industrial sightings and high asthma hospitalization rates, it's a true correlation between the two. It's a cause and effect. So I'm happy to be here today to talk about the issues that we know are facing our communities of color in the Bronx, but also about solutions and how we're not just opposing, but we're proposing. And our community is looking inward to find our solutions, because we can't expect them to come from the top down. Because relying on top-down decisions has not created the solutions, create the problems. So in order for us to create the groundswell of real solutions, we have to look at, well, we know what the problem is, but how can we get to a solution? And what we've tried to do, and I'm not gonna take too much time in this intro, but what we've tried to do is create research-driven solutions. So we've partnered with the Mailman School of Public Health in Columbia, did our own air quality monitoring and traffic counting. We're doing crowdsourcing data around seeing how traffic has changed over periods of time and how we can actually activate our peninsula for actual green space and recreational opportunities for our community. So we have a Mott Haven Port Morris waterfront plan. And with that, we're also going to look at not just creating access for recreation, but flood mitigation. And so we thought we were fighting to protect ourselves from sea level rise and storm surge. We found COVID was a true storm coming abroad. And so it's really important for us to talk today about solution-oriented change and how we create the change we're looking for. And I'm glad to be here. And I'll conclude there. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And sorry about that. I think a really good place to start, I definitely want to get to a place where we're talking about sort of the solutions, but how would you, but in order to talk about the solutions, I think it would be maybe beneficial for the audience who maybe haven't attended another session to get sort of their heads around the problem. And so I guess the first question that I have for the panel is sort of, broadly, what are the critical issues facing the Bronx, especially with this overlap of sort of environmental justice and climate change? And are some of these issues distinct from what the rest of the state or what the rest of the city is facing? Anyone?
Well, I can say a few words. I mean, I think the Bronx is unique in so many ways, and it's unique because it has so many assets, so many wonderful people, birthplace of hip hop, salsa, you know, so much that it has offered the world. But it's also the state's least healthiest county. It gets ranked 62nd every year in those Robert Wood Johnson surveys. We have the lowest income congressional district in the country. Formerly called Jose Serrano's district, now Richie Torres. And so there's a lot, I would say there's overlapping challenges of health and of poverty and of environmental quality, and you can't separate those three apart. So I think what Michael was saying about, you know, when COVID hit the Bronx, you know, why did it hit so hard? And we'll be studying that forever. But part of it was because this was a community that was already suffering from so many injustices, including poverty and including poor health that has been inflicted upon it for so many years in so many ways. That leaves it more susceptible, leaves our communities more susceptible to things like COVID and to things like climate change. And we're already seeing that.
And I think one thing I want to add to that, the problem has been the reason why we're the place for the largest significant maritime industrial area, why we're the place where you can circle us with highways, it's always been for the benefit of New York City or New York State to create economic opportunity, supposedly, and job creation, which never trickled down. And all we got from that was the exhaust from the vehicles that encircled us. So the problem is, the root cause is how these plans are happening without real understanding of its cumulative effect on the environment or on our community, not just looking at a microcosm of one development at a time. But then you have to make sure also that these projects go through vigorous environmental analysis. And we've seen over and over again that a lot of developments are happening on draft environmental impact statements. That would not be allowed in Community Board 1 in Manhattan, but it's allowed in Community Board 1 in the Bronx. And so the problem is the cyclical cycle of it happening over and over again without us putting some sort of a linchpin in it to stop that cycle. Stop acting like you're creating jobs for us when you're not allowing us to breathe fresh air. We can't work if we can't breathe, right? So, and economic opportunity should be definitely where you put these developments are. Job creation isn't mandated for these developments that are going on in our community, you know? So it's not about community benefit agreements, because unless they are really binding and then are really created by the community, and we should be the beneficiary of whatever happens around in our area, and we often aren't. So I think that's the nucleus of the problem. And land, because land has been like that nucleus of how everything has been revolved around the use of land, and it's not being beneficial to us.
So I'm going to jump in there before Robert. I'm going to jump in there before Robert, because Robert probably will have all of the problems here. But I'm going to just say a few things from the perspective that I have begun to learn. And I think Michael said it very well in that if you don't have the community involvement in the discussion right from the very beginning, you oftentimes have politicians, you have your government officials that come into community because they believe they know what's best for the community. And if you are not able to allow the community to really say what they're experiencing, that, you know, you have these, what I call trumped up policies that actually just does not benefit the community per se, but benefits the monies that is coming in from whatever federal government. I heard this morning from Sonia from WEAC in environmental justice. And one of the things that she talked about was what keeps her up at night is, while we're going to get in funding sources from, say, the Biden administration for climate change, her concern is whether or not we would have such red tapes in the bureaucracy that the monies that's designed for some of these projects actually get to some of the real needs in our community. And so that is really, so I can actually speak for, my involvement in Washington, D.C., where this particular community that I was working with was right around the new stadium, the Audi soccer stadium. The Audi soccer stadium, it's going to take in millions of dollars or billions of dollars over time. And we actually, this particular community asked for humidifiers, because this particular group of people that lived in this neighborhood were suffering from all of the dust that was being generated as a result of the construction in that area. Of course, they gave a $50,000 grant. So a $50,000 grant does nothing when they're going to make millions of dollars from, people coming into the stadium to actually enjoy the soccer games. Yet this particular community really was not actually considered when all of these plannings happen. So I can certainly say, and I'll wrap to say that community input is very important. And that's one of the things that, as an academician, as a researcher, we want to help communities find their voice in order to stand before these politicians to say, here's what's happening. And certainly not from an emotional standpoint, but from a research-driven, policy-driven perspective. And that is one of the things that I have been happy to be able to be a part of.
So thank you. It's one thing when the community finds their voice, and to hear that it doesn't matter. Okay, power has not cared what the Bronx community wants and says. And I just want to make that clear, because Bronx Council of Environmental Quality and everybody in this room knows about the tradition of Bronx activism that has some wins, but has really been facing a wall of what people think the Bronx is good for. And I just want to say that when you zoom out and take a look at that picture of the Bronx, you're looking at Van Cortlandt Park on the left, and you're looking at Pelham Park on the right, and the city says, you have all that green space, you're done. Okay, but everybody knows that that's green space segregation. Most of the Bronx aren't their front yards. You do not find a green Bronx. You find them in the north and the northwest and the northeast, but the rest of the borough does not have the green space it needs. And that's because we have siloed, okay, green space to be the job of parks. That is a huge mistake, because the parks are the most endangered. They don't even have a budget. They're the most endangered part of our city fiscal structure. If you wanted to give green space to the responsibility of the agency that has the least fiscal leverage, you're going to pick parks, okay? And that is a false thing to seek after, to let parks solve all our problems, even if we were going to fully fund it, which it never has been. Now, the Bronx River Alliance is a showpiece and a model. Bronx Council of Environmental Quality years ago created a whole network of greenways and potential waterways that could build community activism. That is a fantastic result of community activism. And I fear that it will be the end. Maggie, I know it's going to continue and your support is growing, but I don't want that to be the token environmental restoration project of the Bronx. And I say that because since the Bloomberg administration, and Michael has had a front row seat to this, there has been a deindustrialization project, this goes back probably before Bloomberg, to start monetizing waterfront property. And in the previous administration, before de Blasio, it was Fresh Direct, it was big boxes, okay? That yielded more truck traffic. I've been on both sides, the activist side. I've been a community board chair. I've sat in commissions where I see these decisions get made. The community's voice is noted and then the economic development project goes on, okay? And we want to know what the biggest problem is, that the economic development initiatives priorities are still to seek that big builder who will put the stamp of approval on the borough that needs supposedly the approval of the big industrial plant, the franchise, the corporation. And I have to say that it incenses me that the Bronx needs anybody's approval, okay? That we need to gentrify to be a bona fide part of the city of New York and get our resources. That is just an insult to the people who have restored the Bronx to where it is after the city walked away. And you see this now along the waterfront. I mentioned deindustrialization. It is the now affordable housing has become the new developer-driven project to preclude parks uses. We are lucky to get the waterfront parks we're getting, the waterfront access, but you're now going through private developers. You don't have this in Manhattan. You don't have to go through the private developer to go through the waterfront. Now there's gonna be these easements and POPs and MOUs and win-win scenarios because the Bronx feels it has to seek out big development, especially on its waterfront, monetize those views, get private capital in here. And so they're letting that sector do the work instead of investing in green space and green infrastructure, especially among the fragile communities that face the waterfront and the vulnerable communities that need it the most. So I'm going to hear win-win, you're going to hear win-win, and I'm going to look for that green space, fresh air and fresh water. And I'm hoping we find it, but I'm not seeing it now.
I feel
So
like
you
one
wanted
of
to know the problem.
I feel like one of the themes that I'm hearing kind of across the board is a need for resident engagement and resident activism, but also that sometimes as residents aren't being heard. So if you're a Bronx resident and you want to get engaged around this, how do you do it? And how do you do it in a way that forces officials to actually pay attention to you?
Yeah, Michael, go. Take that, Michael.
You're gonna give it to me, huh, Robert? Okay.
And I'm ready for it. I just don't want to go on. So,
Okay.
But you go.
How we identify that, which that is one of the greatest objectives. How do we mobilize our community? I think we first have to let them realize they're not going through it alone. We go to different classrooms and schools and we speak to the students. They don't know what environmental justice means. What, you a tree hugger? What you like water? What's up with that? You know, we're talking about South Bronx kids, right? Any child wouldn't understand what that means. When you ask them a question that may affect their lives, like, do you know anyone or do you have asthma yourself? So do you know anyone who has asthma or do you have asthma? And typically in these classrooms, 90% of children raise their hands. With that, we can mobilize, because then we can say, don't normalize that. The problem is because of X, Y, and Z, and this is what we can do together to change it. And when we engage our children, we engage the family. You know, where we have people in our communities working 2 jobs, they don't have time to go to public hearings to tell what they think, right? But if we bring their children to the table, they're going to come as well. We have to denormalize the situation as being normal, and we can't do anything about it. That our civic engagement is our way of changing it. And so it's really showing how important we are together. And the fact that any change and any type of advancements we've had as a people has only come because we gathered and came together to change the way it is. Right now, we wouldn't be sharing this screen. It wasn't for racial justice. It wasn't for freeing the enslaved people of this country. So that happened because people came together. And it's the only way we've ever been able to achieve what we need to achieve. I just want to also say one thing, you know, it's a quote that I'm adding to a James Baldwin quote, right? It says, solving all the injustice we see is difficult, but justice will not materialize without action. And so if our children, our community want justice, which they do, they don't want to be treated the way they are. So we show them the action. Their action is what's is required to change that dynamic, and show them how we can do it. And I saw some questions about what success have we had. We have to really get out of the mindset of immediate gratification as wins. We're planting seeds for change. But of course we need wins. And I push back a little bit on what wins look like. And I think we all will have our ideas what that is. But when we ever come together, that's our win. Because we're going to continue to change things because of our collective efforts. And yeah, so we'll talk more about it. I hope that helped to answer the question. But that was a good question. And thanks, Robert, for throwing it in on my lap.
All good.
Does anyone else want to chime in?
Yeah, I'm sure Maggie does. And I definitely want to. Maggie, go ahead.
Okay, now Robert's turn it to me. Well, I think what Michael said was so great, you know, and I think it is about making direct experiences possible for people in the Bronx to realize that there is nature here in the middle of the concrete jungle, right? That we do have, despite everything, there is an annual fish migration. Fish come from the Sargasso Sea up to the Bronx River, you know, every year. And so those kinds of like experiences, you can read about them in a book, but it's a wholly different experience to get out on the river, to like get a net, scoop up some fish, see what you can find. And I think, you know, for many of us, we grew up with those experiences of nature. I know I did, and it's what motivated me to pursue the career I've pursued. And I think that, you know, having those connections to nature, having whatever experiences, especially young people can have in nature, is extremely formative and extremely motivating. I think that's what sticks with you in the long run to help you over when it's hard, because it gets hard. You know, as Michael says, these successes aren't easy. So you have to be kind of stubborn and persistent enough, and you have to have some sort of core within you that's going to help you stay the course.
So Lehman students, I hope you're listening, because by the time you get to college, you're expected not to care about the environment anymore. And what I find, your dean will solve that. Your urban studies program, this will solve that. But the reason I'm saying that is because environmental education has had an incredible outreach campaign to reach K through 12. If you're an educator, you teach environmental education. These organizations and efforts, young people are the lifeblood of the modern environmental movement. I just need to say that. We would be nowhere without young people's outreach and education programs. Every organization, that is the fiscal structure, a lot of them, how they work. I just want to also say that that is how we have expanded the profile of environmental justice. We should not take a bow, though, because it's a narrow, Michael mentioned this before, there is a narrow sluice through which land use decisions are made. And it's called the Euler process in the city of New York, and they issue environmental impact statements, and those are closed to all but the nerds and the committed people. And what you see when you see the 95% of people who want a clean Bronx and a green Bronx and waterfront access, those are the people out and doing incredible things. And then it's that 5% who actually make the final decision about, are you going to build Fresh Direct and Community Board 1 and create that is the gate that we have to open more. Okay, and that means community boards, they have a role, everybody knows that, but we also have to put pressure on them to make more community-based decisions and not just seek that quote unquote economic impact that's going to solve everybody's problems. As Michael said, it rarely builds local jobs. We've heard this so often, it's the old sugar high that people think is going to trickle down, and it does not. Now, having said that, just this past weekend, my colleague Chauncey Young in the Harlem River Working Group, that was a visioning group that actually pulled together people from the High Bridge and Concourse section. We partnered with Transportation Alternatives. We had 200 people on bikes demonstrating the problem of access between Sedgwick Ave along University Ave along the Harlem River in the Bronx and these new waterfront parks that we're helping to build right now. Now, that is an incredible spectacle. When I see that, I just thank God I live in the greatest borough in the city of New York, because people get out there and show how much they love it. A multiracial coalition that just is not going to take a back seat anymore. We always need that push. The other problem, I just want to hand this off to another question maybe, but why is it so hard to get to the waterfront? It's those overlapping and conflicting jurisdictions, federal, state, MTA, city. There's often not one decision maker there. There's often multiple. And when decisions get hard and multi-layered and attenuated across multiple decision makers, that's when communities of color get screwed. All communities get screwed when the accountability is not with only one person. And that's what you find at the waterfront. Anyway, I just preempted another question, sorry.
I actually have one quick follow-up question for you, Robert, given our audience. Can you spell ULURP?
Yeah, it's the Uniform Land Review, hold on, ULURP.
And you want to state clearly what it means?
Yeah, that's the process that the city requires to change zoning or change the property of land.
Sorry, I mean,
public
like
to private.
Uniform Land
Review, Michael, help me out here. Uniform Land Use
Review
Review Process. Uniform Land,
Uniform Land Use Review Process.
Yeah, and they're required by city and state law to issue environmental impact statements that are frequently misleading, false, incomplete, especially where socioeconomic impacts. For instance, I want to talk about resilience and about how badly we're handling resilience. I know you talk about climate change, but
we'll get to that in a second.
yeah.
Circling back a little bit, one of the things that has come up a lot, I think, across the panel is how important, how it feels to me that you're saying that the first thing that you should, that in order to get people engaged, the first thing is not like sign this petition or join our movement. It's get them outside. It's get them into the environment. Is that, am I misconstruing what I'm hearing?
It's not either or.
I think it's helpful to get folks on the ground to feel the injustice.
Absolutely.
You know, and just the same way it is did a bike tour, BCQ and Chauncey with Harlem River Working Group, but we do environmental justice walking tours and bike tours. We also do Jane's walks. It's really important to feel it, to smell the injustice, to create action, right? And I think it's a really important thing to do, especially with children who are living in our community, don't even know waters are in their community. Mm-hmm. There's a waterfront in our neighborhood, and they're like, what are you talking about? Where is it? Because they can't get to it. So when we take them there and show them how hard it is to get to, you just activated them. And now they want to create change. So they want equity. They want to, you know, so I think it protests and petitions are useful tools, but nothing like being there.
I want to jump in there too. Then I, just get into the Bronx, but I want to actually go back to the last question that I didn't get a chance to say anything about. And that is, you are, Michael said it very nicely, getting young people involved in the whole movement is really important, because certainly, as Robert said, that's our lifeblood. They are going to be the ones to continue to facilitate that. And then, of course, you said getting families out in the nature is really important. And not just getting them out in the nature to protest or even smell injustice, but just getting them out there in the nature to realize that, oh my goodness, this is what trees do for my neighborhood. This is what, and that I think is a really important component. Now, coming back to, my role as dean at Lehman College, certainly, I'm new here, but that is one of the things that I would love very much to kind of partner with my colleagues in other departments that are more responsible for the environmental components of our curriculum, because that is something I'm very familiar with. You know, I taught in the environmental studies program at my previous university, and certainly that's how you get our young people involved. Oftentimes they don't always know, you know, when we talk about environment, and you said it right, you know, what is this tree hugging thing? It is more than just that, you know, we really do want to, you know, kind of inform them, give them information about why their role as, you know, our citizens that we are training or educating to really understand why the environment is so important. And so I hope to be able to be instrumental in helping in moving some of those little needles at our college with many of our students in that particular area. I think that that's very, very important.
Sorry, thank you. One question that I have is, it seems the waterfront is a really big kind of consistent issue that's coming up in the Bronx. And one point of confusion I have as a climate reporter from a climate perspective, this push for development on the waterfront seems not wise. In the sense that, like, it is at some point you're going to have to spend a tremendous amount of money when those properties inevitably get damaged. And I was wondering if anyone could speak a little bit about to that tension and sort of that issue sort of moving forward, and like why this big push for development is happening in this context of rising sea level.
Yep. So the city saw lightning struck in Williamsburg and they wanted to strike again. Okay. They want to continue the Williamsburg transformation to the Bronx. You've seen it at Long Island City. This is part of the plan, what's happening now. Mm-hmm. It's a disaster because it actually overrides community stakeholders and plans and visions that colleagues here on this panel have spent their lifetime trying to build. And it does really invite a new economy of affordable housing into waterfront planning, which is often a game changer and a kind of disruptive element in the whole thing. And we often find that they're at cross purposes. So an affordable housing project will get incredible private equity, and the mayor's office and everyone's behind it. What happened to the long gestated working group plans, the Harlem River Working Group, the South Bronx plans to actually build an affordable and sustainable waterfront? And that has changed a lot of calculations, I have to say. The thing that's really troubling is that the Department of Environmental Protection is under consent decree, like DC has been, to purify its water. And they are building, it's called a long-term control plan to handle the amount of wastewater that goes into our sewage treatment plants in the Harlem River. And every time they build, every time they plan and invest in more sewage, more green infrastructure that could actually take care of the water produced by new development and also soak up the water from climate change. The more we build, obviously, the less water we can soak up on land. All that water is going to end up in the river and make it more polluted, spend more billions of dollars. And I feel that every time that the Department of Environmental Protection gets a calculation for, we need this much green space, we need this much sewage capacity to handle our water from storms and from development, there's another development, and it just pushes the whole planning out and new goalposts. So this New York is a dynamic city, but especially along the waterfront, we're seeing this gallop, and it's short-circuiting a lot of plans like the Harlem River Greenway, like Michael's communities plans, and also even the DEP's plans to regulate and capture our water.
I think
so waterfront is a huge issue.
I think Maggie has something that she wants to add.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to add, I guess, that the Bronx River is a different model for how this can happen. And on the Bronx River, we are developing the Bronx River Greenway as a system of parks and trails along the river. And in doing so, it's really a form of climate change adaptation. So it's really taking contaminated industrial lots, because all of the waterfront along just about all of the city is former industrial, right? So there's stuff in the soil, and it's instead of it's cleaning up that soil and turning it into public park that can tolerate some degree of flooding, and hopefully renaturalizing the shoreline in the process. So we've taken a concrete plant, we've taken a former manufactured gas plant, a lead window leading factory. You can imagine what's in the soil in these places. And in the process of turning them into parks, are also cleaning up the soils there and helping them prevent human health impacts for when there will be a storm surge, like we saw in Red Hook, right? You saw Red Hook flood, and then there were concerns about, well, what are people exposed to in that water? We want to be planning some degree of retreat. I think the Bronx River is an example of that. And it's an example of how you can have multiple co-benefits in that process. You can have recreational space, which is very needed. You can plant lots and lots of trees that we do, which helps mitigate that urban heat island effect that Peggy Shepard was talking about. And we can improve, health in terms of soils, which we haven't talked about a whole lot today. So anyway, I'm just going to comment on the Bronx River, but I do think the Bronx River offers a different model for how it could be done.
Thank you. I think Michael also has a follow-up.
Yeah. I don't think I want to add is I've been able to be a pleasure to be a part of the comprehensive waterfront plan for New York City by being a member of the New York City Waterfront Management Advisory Board. And one thing has changed since Vision 2020 to now Vision 2030 is the fact of more equity and a more balanced approach to what happens on the waterfront. I think one size doesn't fit all, right? We need to have, mitigation measures for flood zones, which the South Bronx Peninsula is a flood zone. And all those things that are on our peninsula will inundate our community the next sea level rise or major storm hits. But that doesn't really, so we also have to make sure that plan is also making sure that the way people are building or developers are building on waterfront, which isn't always a good thing. I mean, like Robert alluded to, there has been problematic developments on peninsula communities where they don't not only displace folks, but they also contribute to the lack of infrastructure that can handle the water that these buildings are dispersing into through our CSOs and into our waterways. But we're shouldered between the Harlem River and the East River, and then the Bronx Kill at the very southernmost tip of the Bronx. And that's a place that has a certain use that needs to be mitigated in terms of that heavy industrialization. It needs green mitigation measures. It needs resiliency. It needs to balance the industrialization, which they call the working waterfront, and more green space that can also create economic opportunity. I mean, as we all know, people love to go, human beings want to be closer to water. And the more you bring folks closer to water, the more people want to open, entrepreneurs want to bring things that will help deliver services to folks who are there. So that is a job creator, and we often don't look at green as being a job creator. But I think we also are asked the question, if you bring in waterfront access, if you bring more of this to this community, is it going to make it more attractive to gentrification? And our whole argument to that is our folks have been suffering without access for decades, and they're still here and they need it now. And we should have green space created before development. It shouldn't happen because they're building a tall building. They want to make it look really attractive to the folks who want to come to the neighborhood. So they'll build a green esplanade. No, that green esplanade is supposed to exist now. So let's do the opposite approach. Let's our emphasis should be about green waterfront development for recreational opportunities and flood mitigation and job creation before you build a building. If you have to at all, which you shouldn't have to always do that.
Thank you. We've gotten a lot of questions from participants, and before I sort of take some of those and cast them to you, I kind of want to spin to maybe a little bit more of a positive place, which is, what does your vision for a climate adapted equitable Bronx look like? And maybe we can start with Maggie.
Sure. Well, I think there's two things I was kind of thinking I might talk about today that I haven't had a chance to talk about. I'll just quickly try to touch on them both. A lot of folks have been talking about green infrastructure, which is a big, long word, right? Kind of confusing, but essentially we're just talking about rain gardens that help collect stormwater, rainwater on the land to keep it out of the city's combined sewer system so it doesn't contribute to sewage in our waterways, which if you didn't know, we dump thousands of gallons, millions of gallons of sewage into our waterways all across the city. And so that process of creating green infrastructure, I think, is another interesting solution that offers multiple co-benefits, because we're talking about it as a water quality improvement intervention, but it also has benefits because it's distributed throughout the whole city, because we're all in a watershed of one sort or another. And so we need rain gardens everywhere. And a rain garden includes trees and pollinator plants. And so it creates habitat. It helps cool our cities, which are so important as we get more and more of these extreme heat events. And I really do think there's a real potential for green infrastructure and stewardship to be a workforce development opportunity for the city. And so Bronx River Alliance is partnering with the Gowanus Canal Conservancy and Newtown Creek to pilot this. And we're going to be doing some work also with the HOPE program, which is a workforce development program. And so looking at these ideas of as we adapt to climate change, because climate change is here, we have to adapt to it at this point. It's not just about mitigation. How are we going to do it in a sort of geographically dispersed and equitable way? And how are we going to ensure that some of the very jobs that have come out of it can accrue to people who historically, because of racism and other public policies, have been left behind? So that's one thing. And then I'll just quickly wrap up and say the other thing really is education. We've been talking about it in many different forums on this panel. One thing I just want to highlight is we're very excited to be partnering with Lehman College, and we're starting a new partnership with the College Now program, with Griselda, David over there, and Professor Pant, who's the Dean of the Environmental Science program, if I have that right. And we're going to be offering an environmental science course focused on the Bronx River. They do something similar in Van Cortlandt Park as well. And this is an opportunity for high school students to get college credit and a stipend to learn about environmental issues here in the Bronx. And we're really interested in this in terms of building a pipeline for young people in the Bronx, particularly for environmental justice communities, to have a pathway to careers in the environmental sector, because the environmental sector is far too white. And so the people making decisions that affect primarily low-income communities of color do not represent those communities. And that's something that we really need to work on as a community to change. So we're really thrilled to be piloting that this summer with the College Now program.
Awesome, that sounds really cool. Michael?
Yeah, a solution. What we have identified as a way forward to looking, how do we control the nucleus of land? And so we're the only environmental justice advocacy organization that has helped to create a community land trust, where the community can own its own public trust, its own vacant or available land, like that waterfront plan I talked to you about, as a community-owned space. And we're the only community land trust as an environmental justice advocate. So we think, how do we, our solution is not just, again, opposing, but proposing a way forward that creates real community sustainability in a perpetual way, that will take these spaces that they want to potentially build high rises on our waterfront or throughout our community, turn them to spaces that are pulled off the real estate speculative market to create the kind of change we're looking for, to create green space or park space or community centers. But those centers and those spaces will be owned by the community through the community land trust. So that way it's perpetual ownership and taking it off that market of speculation.
Yeah, that has to happen, Michael. Thank you. It's so fantastic. I just like to piggyback on what Maggie and Michael have said, and said that every community should have a Bronx River or feel like they do if they don't live next to the Bronx River. That is a natural water body and a linear park that can activate the community and become a focal point for all levels of education, all generations, and also to adopt their community as a watershed, as a natural body, because what we're seeing is that the Bronx that was built for people is failing its people. For health, the ecology is out of balance. So we need to restore the role of nature in every community and adopt, in a sense, create what, whether it's a waterfront or whether it's a river or a stream or a garden, adopt that the way that the Bronx River has been the focal point of the Central Bronx. I'd also like to say that there is a lot of hope for linear park from Van Cortlandt Park and the border of the Bronx all the way to the South Bronx. It's called the Harlem River Greenway. And piece by piece, the parcels are coming together. The action I mentioned on the weekend was for one portion of it. It's called the Depot Place Overpass. But right now, Fordham Landing is being developed for housing, and included is a park. And there is another parcel of land from 230th Street up to Van Cortlandt Park itself. This would be an incredible game changer to have a linear waterfront park. BECQ was there to bring the vision of Bronx River Alliance. We adopted the Bronx River as our most important cause. We've turned to the Harlem River for the past 20 years now, and we are really hopeful. So we do need support, but we're people are listening. I just want to say there is a vision and there's growing support.
Thank you. El Gloria, before I open it up to audience questions.
Thank you. I just really wanted to, piggyback on what Maggie said, and that is, I'm really happy to hear that we have at Lehman College, and so this is actually for me what's new, some alliance with having an environmental science course. I think that is so very important. I personally think that in addition to the environmental science component of it, that I would like to see the health component of that, because I think those two things come together. And if we talk about climate change and climate justice, you cannot say one without the other. We recognize that some of the social determinants of health are very similar to the same things that we talk about when we talk about climate change and climate justice. Those are the very same thing. So I'm looking forward to being able to get involved with my colleagues at Lehman College in that regard.
Thank you. And now turning it to participant questions. One of the first ones that I think is really important is, what specific policy measures do you think need to be enacted to support vulnerable communities trying to become more resilient? And I think maybe we'll start with Michael this time.
Well, one piece of legislation we're working on on the state level, and it should happen on the federal level. Senate Majority Leader Cousins is about to introduce, if she hasn't already, a cumulative impact legislation, environmental cumulative impact legislation, which I think is important. Again, you don't look at these developments on the micro, we look at how they affect each other and EJ communities particularly, that we can't continue to add to the impact piling on per se, without looking how it happens collectively, cumulatively, and its effects. And I think that will lead to resiliency and mitigation measures, and not just on waterfront, but also air quality and quality of life. And so, like Robert mentioned about the ULEP process, but there's also a state environmental quality review, it's called SECRA. It needs to be intensified to make sure that environmental justice communities like ours, when projects come to these communities, they have heavier scrutiny and heavier benchmarks to supersede before they can be approved. And community participation is heavily weighed, making sure that the concerns are are paramount to any type of movement and development in our communities. Because you can't be recognized by the EPA as an environmental justice community, but you still get the same thing over and over again, which we know is the definition of insanity. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks. If someone has something else they want to contribute, just let me know. Otherwise, we can move on to another question.
I just wanted to make sure everybody heard about the mayor's racial equity, environmental justice equity framework. Okay, it's a great play, and they're taking commentary until April 30th. And they had a launch of a town hall, and what they're looking for are measures of environmental justice in your community that can be whether distance to parks or health impacts or a job impact. So I just want to push everybody to this site. It's called Environmental Justice for All. And it's a mayoral initiative that has to do with how budgets and interagency cooperation happens.
Thank you.
I'll just quickly piggyback on that. I know we want to move on, just to say we have two big opportunities ahead of us. We have the New York State Environmental Bond Act, which is looking like it's going to be coming down the pipe at us this year. And there's a good model through, I forget the acronym, maybe someone else can say it, for the New York State Green New Deal that basically was passed a couple of years ago that has a set aside for environmental justice communities. I think
Yes,
it's 35 or 40%.
Yes.
Yeah. And then of course we have the infrastructure bill, which is looking like the Biden administration is going to be putting forward. So there's just lots of opportunities as this money it's made available to think about climate change adaptation and how we spend this money on our infrastructure so that we're really building climate ready infrastructure, and we're not building the infrastructure of 50 years ago that we know is not going to be the infrastructure that will serve us in the long term.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Everybody, there's a pressing need to have the Bronx cited as an air quality monitoring site for the governor's climate change law. Okay. And they are scoping the impact of the law right now. And I think a really important thing is, and they are looking statewide on air quality measures and how to determine whether the massive changes in all industries are going to affect our air quality. And we have all got to advocate for air quality monitoring in the vulnerable communities of the Bronx. That has to happen. And that's, I'll share these resources with the community here later. But the governor's Climate Leadership and Recovery Act mandates air quality, and they are looking for sites right now. If it doesn't happen in the Bronx, I don't know what that law is for.
Thank you, Robert. Another question that we got, and maybe we'll start with El Gloria, is can you talk about the role of food and transportation in your environmental justice vision of the Bronx?
So food justice, or having a decentralized food system, is really one of the things that really should happen. When we rely on a centralized food systems, most of our communities become very vulnerable, since food has to travel. At least what I've learned from my time in Washington, D.C., when food has to travel from, one side of the coast to the other, and this is what we tell our students, by the time it gets to us, it cannot be picked right in California and brought to Washington, D.C. and expect that it's going to be able to be nutritious. So we have to look at how we actually can decentralize our food system so that we can actually grow food locally. That's number one. Certainly it's something that I have been thinking about, and how that I can, how that is shaped in my school is to be determined. I would like very much to be able to be a catalyst in that particular area. Transportation, oh my goodness. As I began to learn more about the Bronx, and in fact, when I read a couple articles recently about some of the initiatives that are moving to really expand green space in the Bronx, particularly around the whole notion of the Cross Bronx Expressway, and how citizens or the local government could actually assist us with being able to actually cover that area so that there would be more green covering in that particular area. So as I learn more about the Bronx and, how I can really contribute, or how the CUNY Institute for Health Equity and our school could really contribute to the knowledge creation. That is one of the things that I envision or can see my role in helping to facilitate.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to chime in, or? Okay, moving on. This is kind of a long question, but I'm gonna shrink it. It's from someone who's a journalist at the Lehman College newspaper. And she said, or they say that I know that access to information is key to advocacy in the Bronx communities. My question is how to bridge the polarity between the community, environmental advocates, with the state and huge corporations who are trusted to manage green spaces, reservoirs, and protected lands in the Bronx. And I feel like Michael might be a good place to start with this one.
I'll try. I'll definitely
No
try.
pressure.
No, yeah, no pressure. Only thing comes to mind is on a state level, one main body of government, or part of our state government, really has a lot to do with that, is the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. They permit the waste transfer stations, they permit the peaker plants. On anything industrial happens of a certain impact on the community has to get a permit from DEC. We're talking about waste incineration or waste transporting through our communities. So I think DEC's teeth is only as sharp as EPA's teeth are. And I think, but on the state level, the governor, the state assembly can actually give more teeth to DEC to make sure that there is this not only advocacy on the ground, but they have a partner in the state government that makes sure that we are in a place where there's different measures are being put in place to change. And that's, I'm gonna add one thing about the food question. In our community gardens is huge because of the lack of green space we have. So out of necessity, our community came together and created its own green space and started planting its own food, and they share it locally. And I think that's the way forward. We had to create urban farms and communities that have our food deserts, quote unquote.
Right.
And we have that space that's easily state-owned or city-owned. Let's build it for the betterment of reducing the food insecurities and these food deserts that are occurring in communities of color that often are EPA recognized environmental justice communities.
I'd like to take that question just for a second, thanks. And I think that many New York area newspapers don't understand that the Bronx has an environmental beat. And it's, like the beating heart of the borough, that's really what we face every day. So it is really great. We thrive and live off community-based journalism, okay? I was chair of the Croton Filtration Monitoring Committee, right up the street from Lehman, and we were nowhere without the Norwood News, okay? You need that active local press, including student newspapers like Lehman, to really have those contacts with local community activists. And we really everybody needs that story. We push it out. News 12 just did a great story on our Harlem River access demonstration on Saturday. So journalism plays an incredible role because we are bringing to visibility this hidden ecology and activism of the Bronx that the rest of the city really needs to hear. Decision makers watch this stuff. I also want to say that what Michael said is incredibly important about DEC. And I have found the state is a little bit more easy to handle when it comes to knowing what's going to happen environmentally. They have something called the Environmental Notice Bulletin, and it drops, I think, every 2 weeks or something. And they'll tell you where environmental impact statements have been filed, where there is current action happening under the DEC's environmental review. You won't really get that from the city as clearly, but in terms of that one-stop shopping, you can see Environmental Notice Bulletin. It's a great place to start with what projects are up for review. And then, like I said, those local contacts, journalism, we need each other.
Thank you. I think we are approaching the end. We have less than a minute left. So if anyone has like something they want to get across in the next 15 seconds.
I just want to put a plug for community science and data collection as an alternative to government sources of data as well. So I think it could be a whole separate panel. I could certainly say a lot about it, but I just want to say that there's a lot of potential there.
Cool. Thank you, Maggie. And actually thank everyone. Thank you, Robert and Algoria and Michael for this great panel. Before we move on to the closing remarks for day 1 of the summit, I want to remind everyone to direct any additional questions that you may have for our panelists to the networking section of this event platform. Lawrence Kelly is up next with closing remarks. We hope to see you all there and for tomorrow morning sessions. Bye, everyone.